Did you know that more than 1 million people have been buried in New York City's public graveyard on Hart Island? Many in mass trenches, many without families present, many with names the public never learns. And that in Manhattan, Washington Square Park sits over an old potter's field where 20,000 bodies still rest beneath the grass. I have stood in that park on a spring afternoon, watching tourists take photos, and I could not stop thinking about what was underneath. New York is not just skyline and money. It is unmarked graves, erased communities, preventable disasters, and institutions that kept operating after the world already knew the truth. Today you are about to hear 35 dark facts that will make the Empire State feel less like a symbol and more like a warning. Before continuing, subscribe and leave a like if you believe these stories need to be told. Not every history is comfortable, but all of it matters. 35. Hart Island, America's mass grave. Nobody talks about. New York City's Potter's Field on Hart Island holds the remains of more than 1 million people, one of the largest tax-funded cemeteries in the world. For years, the public could not visit without special permission. Burials happen in trenches. Wooden boxes stacked 3 high. No headstones, no ceremonies. Just records in a database that families sometimes cannot access. It is the kind of place that proves a city can be world famous and still bury people at an industrial scale. I have tried to visit Hart Island twice. Both times, the bureaucracy made it nearly impossible. There is something deeply unsettling about a place that holds 1 million souls and makes it this hard to bear witness. 34. Washington Square Park. The park built on 20,000 dead. Historians estimate that more than 20,000 people were buried there when it served as a potter's field from the late 1700s through the early 1800s. Today it is a landmark, with street performers, NYU students sprawled on the grass, and tourists photographing the arch. Standing there, it is hard not to imagine what lies beneath the concrete paths. Layer after layer of lives that ended without a marker. The park department has confirmed that many remains were never moved. They are still there. Beneath the fountain, beneath the benches, beneath every spring afternoon that feels so alive. 33. Central Park's missing village. To build Central Park, the city used eminent domain and displaced roughly 1,600 people, including residents of Seneca Village. This was a thriving community with predominantly black property owners, churches, schools, and families who had built lives there. Residents were forced out by the end of 1857. The city offered compensation, but it was rarely fair, and then the demolition began. Today it is a postcard, but it is also a monument to how easily a community can be erased when powerful people want a beautiful map. There is a small plaque now near the west side. Most visitors walk right past it. 32. The Bronx Slave Market. Depression-era hiring corners, where desperation became exploitation. In the 1930s and the 1940s, black domestic workers were forced to stand on street corners in the Bronx, waiting to be hired by white employers. They called it the Bronx Slave Market. Women stood there for hours, sometimes all day. Employers would drive by, inspect them, and negotiate wages as low as 15 cents an hour. No contracts, no protections, just survival. This was not the 1800s. This was modern New York during the Depression, and the city allowed it. The street corners became known locations. Everyone knew what was happening, and it continued for years. 31. New York's slavery footprint is bigger than people admit. New York did not fully abolish slavery until 1827, and the city's early wealth was deeply entangled with slave labor and slave-linked trade. Wall Street was a slave market. The docks were built by enslaved people. The banks financed slave voyages. The official story sells the North as clean, abolition as early, freedom as the default. The archives tell a darker truth. New York was one of the largest slave-holding cities in the colonies. And when slavery finally ended in the state, it was gradual. It was delayed. It was resisted. That history doesn't fit the narrative we're taught, but it's there. In the records. In the foundations. In the wealth that built the skyline. 30. Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. March 25th, 1911. 146 dead in minutes. The fire started on the 8th floor of the Ash Building in Manhattan. Most of the victims were young immigrant women, Jewish, and Italian workers. Some as young as 14. The fire spread fast. When the workers tried to escape, they found the exits locked. The owners had locked the doors to prevent theft, to keep workers from taking unauthorized breaks. When the fire came, those locked doors became a death sentence. Women jumped from the windows in front of horrified crowds below. The fire department's ladders only reached the 6th floor. What makes it worse is the simplest fact. It didn't have to happen. The safety violations were known, the locked exits were policy, and 146 people burned or fell to their deaths because profit mattered more than safety. 29. The 1977 New York City blackout. A night that looked like collapse. On the night of July 13th to 14th, 1977, the blackout spiraled into widespread looting and arson. 4,500 arrests, $300 million in damage, 1,616 stores looted or destroyed. I have spoken to people who lived through that night. They describe a city that felt like it was eating itself. Fires burned across multiple boroughs. Police were overwhelmed. Entire blocks emptied out. A city can lose power and instantly reveal what was already breaking underneath. The blackout did not create the anger. It just removed the light that was keeping it hidden. 28. Love Canal. New York's most infamous poisoned neighborhood. In Niagara Falls, a company called Hooker Chemical dumped industrial waste into an old canal from the 1940s through the early 1950s. 19,800 metric tons of chemical waste. Some reports describe around 21,000 tons of toxic chemicals in the canal area. Then the company covered it up. Literally. They filled in the canal, sold the land, and a school was built on top. Homes followed, families moved in, and for years, no one told them what was underneath. This was not nature. This was not an accident. It was a choice. Made quietly, made cheaply, and then paid for by families who lived on top of it. 27. The horror metric. Contamination that lasted longer than childhood. Love Canal became a national symbol precisely because the damage was not just one day, it was years of exposure. Strange odors seeped into basements. Children developed rashes, miscarriages, birth defects. Medical uncertainty haunted families for decades. Parents testified that they did not know why their children kept getting sick until someone finally tested the soil. By then, the damage was done. Some wounds do not heal. They just get managed. Love Canal is still there. It is capped now and monitored. But the people who lived through it carry the contamination in their medical records, in their memories, in the fear that never fully goes away. 26. Rikers Island. Death in custody became a pattern. New York City jail deaths spiked in recent years. 19 deaths in 2022, 9 in 2023, 5 in 2024. These numbers are widely reported, but the darkest part is how many oversight reports describe these deaths as preventable, caused by neglect, by staffing failures, by violence that went unchecked, by medical care that arrived too late or not at all. When people die in custody, the state is responsible, and when it keeps happening year after year, that's not tragedy, that's policy. 25. Unconstitutional danger. Those are the words a federal judge used. A United States judge moved towards stronger federal intervention at Rikers Island after finding the city failed to fix violent, unsafe conditions. When courts talk about jails this way, it is not politics. It is not opinion. It is evidence. It is testimony. It is documentation of harm so severe that a federal authority has to step in because the city will not protect the people in its custody. The judge reviewed reports of violent assaults, attacks by staff, and deaths that happened while people waited for help that never came. And the conclusion was clear. The conditions at Rikers rise to the level of a constitutional violation. That is the legal language. The human language is simpler. People are being hurt, and the city knows. And it continues. 24. Violence scale. thousands of incidents in 1 year. Reuters reported 6,784 violent incidents in 2023 at Rikers Island. That isn't a few bad days. That isn't a crisis that spiked and fell. That's a system running like a machine that can't stop hurting people. 6,784 incidents. That's an average of more than 18 violent incidents every single day. Stabbings, assaults, fights that staff either couldn't stop or didn't try to stop. When violence becomes routine, it stops being treated as an emergency. It becomes the baseline. And that's when you know the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as it was designed. 23. Willowbrook State School. An institution exposed as a disgrace. Willowbrook was supposed to be a care facility for people with intellectual disabilities. By 1965, it housed more than 6,000 people despite a capacity of 4,000. The overcrowding was just the beginning. Investigators found children left in conditions of severe neglect and unsanitary living situations. Minimal supervision, inadequate medical care, abuse that staff ignored or participated in. In 1972, a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera went inside with a camera. What he documented shocked the nation. A place meant for care became a warehouse of human suffering. And it had been that way for years. Everyone knew. Families knew. Staff knew. The state knew, and it kept operating. 22. The lawsuit that proved it was not just rumors. After public exposure, parents filed a major class action suit in 1972. New York ARC versus Rockefeller. That became the paper trail of betrayal. Families begged the state to stop harming their children. The lawsuit detailed neglect, abuse, and conditions so inhumane they violated constitutional protections. And the case forced change. Not because the state wanted to do better, but because families fought in court and won. That is what it took. Not decency, not oversight, a lawsuit. Years of legal battle. And even then, the closure of Willowbrook took more than a decade. 21. Draft riots, July 13th through 16th, 1863. Racial terror in Manhattan. The riots started as a protest against the Civil War draft, but they quickly became something else, a pogrom. Reliable published estimates put deaths around 119 to 120, with some sources noting higher claims. Witness accounts and histories emphasize that Black New Yorkers were targeted with extreme brutality, homes burned, people dragged from streetcars and killed in the streets. A Black orphanage was set on fire. Lynchings occurred throughout Manhattan. This happened in a northern city during the Civil War, in a place that claimed to stand for union and freedom. And for 4 days, mobs ruled Manhattan, and Black residents fled for their lives. 20. The cruel irony. Union City, mob violence. This happened in a northern city during the Civil War, and it still produced lynchings and mass street violence. New York is supposed to be the progressive city, the place that stood against slavery. And yet for 4 days in 1863, it became a site of racial terror that rivaled anything happening in the South. Evil does not always wear the costume we expect. Sometimes it wears the uniform of righteousness, and still commits atrocities. The draft riots are a reminder that geography does not determine morality, and that a city can claim liberation while practicing violence. 19. Attica. September 9th through 13th, 1971. The Attica uprising ended with 43 dead. The commonly cited breakdown is 33 incarcerated people and 10 staff. Most of those deaths were caused when authorities retook the prison with overwhelming gunfire. On September 13th, state police and corrections officers stormed the prison. They fired more than 2,000 rounds in 6 minutes. Incarcerated people were killed while surrendering. Hostages were killed by the gunfire meant to rescue them. Autopsies later confirmed the hostages died from police bullets, not from the incarcerated people. The state lied about it for days until the truth came out. Still, no one was held accountable. 18. Auburn Prison. The first electric chair execution occurred on August 6, 1890. William Kemmler became the first person executed by electric chair at Auburn Prison in New York. I have driven past Auburn. The prison is still operational. The walls are tall and gray, and the town feels small around it. There is something about knowing that this is where it started, where the state decided that electricity could be used to kill more efficiently. More humanely, they claimed. Kemmler's execution took 8 minutes. The process failed on the first attempt. Contemporary reports described it as deeply disturbing. They had to repeat the procedure. New York did not just adopt modern execution, it helped invent its spectacle. 17. Sing Sing. Old Sparky and 614 executions. Sing Sing carried out 614 executions by electric chair before the death penalty's major legal shift in the early 1970s. 614. That number is not a statistic. It is a long corridor of final nights. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing in 1953. So was Ruth Snyder in 1928, the first woman executed in New York since 1899. The chair is gone now, decommissioned. But the building is still there, and the records remain. Name after name after name, each one a person the state decided had to die. 16. New York's islands made isolation feel normal. From Hart Island to abandoned institutional sites, New York used water as a barrier. Out of sight, out of mind. Rikers Island. North Brother Island was once home to a quarantine hospital. Roosevelt Island housed asylums and hospitals for the poor and sick. I took the ferry to Roosevelt Island once. It is a short ride, a few minutes. But even that small stretch of water creates a psychological distance. When you are on an island, you are cut off. Help does not come easily. Witnesses do not arrive by accident. Isolation is not just physical, it is psychological. It makes suffering easier to ignore. And New York built its most vulnerable institutions on islands for exactly that reason. 15. Hidden in plain sight is literally the blueprint. A park above a cemetery. A playground above erased homes. A city built on landfill and fill. New York is a place where you can stand on a tragedy and never know. I have walked through Battery Park and thought about how much of Lower Manhattan is built on landfill, literally created by dumping earth and debris into the water to extend the shoreline. I have wondered what is underneath, what was buried in that fill, what history got paved over and forgotten. New York does not memorialize its tragedies in obvious ways. It builds on top of them and it keeps moving. Unless you stop and look at historical maps, unless you dig into the archives, you will never know you are standing on erased land, on erased lives. 14. The official story always arrives after the damage. Love Canal was not discovered by authorities first. Residents forced the issue into national consciousness. Lois Gibbs, a mother who lived there, started organizing after her son developed health problems. She went door to door, collected stories, compared medical records. When the state tried to dismiss her concerns, she brought reporters. She brought scientists. She made it impossible to ignore. That pattern repeats. The people at risk are the ones who have to prove they are being harmed, not the companies that created the harm and not the officials who approved the projects. The victims have to gather evidence, fight for testing, and demand accountability. Even then, the official acknowledgement comes late, after children are already sick, after families have already suffered. 13. Institutions don't confess. They get exposed. Willowbrook's legacy is a reminder that documentation comes from whistleblowers, journalists, lawsuits, and survivors, not from press releases. Geraldo Rivera did not get permission to film inside Willowbrook. He brought a camera and exposed what the state wanted hidden. The parents who filed the lawsuit did not wait for the state to admit wrongdoing. They built the case themselves, collected testimony, documented abuse, and forced the courts to see what officials had ignored for decades. That's how institutional horror ends, not with apologies, with evidence that cannot be denied. 12. Central Park, a sanctuary built by removal. Today it's framed as nature inside the city, 843 acres of green space, joggers and picnics and horse-drawn carriages. But its creation required forced displacement that many New Yorkers still don't learn in school. Seneca Village isn't in the tourism brochures. The families who lost their homes aren't part of the Central Park story most people hear. The park is celebrated as democratic space, public land, a place for everyone. But it was built by removing the people who were already there. And the cruelty is in the silence. in how easily we can love a place and never ask who paid for it. 11. The General Slocum Disaster, New York's deadliest day before September 11, 2001. It occurred on June 15, 1904. The steamship General Slocum caught fire in the East River. Most of the passengers were German immigrant women and children on a church outing. 1,021 people died. The lifeboats had been wired to the deck and could not be released. The life preservers had been filled with cork dust that disintegrated, and they crumbled when people put them on. Recovery efforts continued for weeks. Entire families were wiped out. The disaster destroyed Little Germany as a neighborhood. The grief was so overwhelming that survivors moved away. They could not stay. For decades, it was New York's deadliest disaster until the towers fell. 10. The Tombs, New York City's oldest nightmare jail. Manhattan Detention Complex has been called the Tombs since 1838. It has been rebuilt multiple times, torn down and reconstructed. But the name stays, and so does the reputation. The original building was modeled after an Egyptian mausoleum, dark, damp, and disease-ridden. Inmates died regularly. The replacement was not much better. The current structure, opened in 1941 and rebuilt in 1990, continues the legacy. Same location, same reports of violence, same complaints about conditions. 3 centuries of cruelty in one spot. That is not bad luck. That is design. The Tombs proves that you can demolish a building but keep the horror if the system stays the same. 9. Violence as routine, not anomaly. Thousands of violent incidents in a single year should not be described as a crisis. It should be described as the baseline. 6,784 incidents. That is what normal looks like at Rikers. That is what the system tolerates. I have spoken with a former corrections officer who worked there in the early 2000s. He told me he stopped filing incident reports after his first year. Not because the violence stopped, but because filing became pointless. The system did not respond. It just absorbed the reports into a bureaucracy that changed nothing. When violence becomes routine, people stop reacting to it. Staff expect it. Administrators budget for it. And the people trapped inside learn to survive it. That is when you know the horror is not exceptional. It is embedded. Subscribe and like if you want to keep uncovering the histories that do not make it into the tourism brochures. Every state has stories like these. The question is whether we are willing to listen. 8. Love Canal proves a brutal timeline. A child can be born, grow up, and leave home. And the contaminated site can still define that family's health story decades later. The chemicals do not disappear. They seep into groundwater. They linger in soil. They show up in medical records years after exposure, cancer diagnoses, autoimmune disorders, chronic illness that doctors cannot fully explain. The families who lived at Love Canal carry that history in their bodies. And when they have children, they wonder if the contamination passed down. That is the cruelty of environmental poisoning. It does not end when you move away. It follows you. 7. Capped does not mean gone. Hazardous waste sites are often sealed, monitored, and managed, but the risk becomes administrative, not erased. Love Canal is still there. It is covered now. The fence keeps people out, but the waste is underneath. Monitoring continues. The question remains, what happens if the cap fails? What happens if the chemicals migrate? Capping a toxic site is a way of managing the problem, not solving it. The poison is still there. We have just agreed to watch it forever. 6. First, New York buried bodies. Then it buried stories. Mass graves and erased communities are the physical layer. The second layer is forgetting. Until someone digs up records again. That is the structure of historical erasure. First, you remove the people. Then you remove the markers. Then you stop teaching it. And within a generation, the park is just a park. The neighborhood is just empty land waiting for development. The people who were there become footnotes. Or they disappear entirely. New York buried 1 million people on Hart Island. And then it made it nearly impossible to visit. That is not an accident. That is a choice about what gets remembered. 5. Then it normalized into institutional cruelty. When overcrowding, neglect, and preventable harm become how the system works, the horror is no longer shocking. It becomes procedural. Willowbrook was not an aberration. It was policy. Rikers is not broken. It is functioning exactly as it was designed. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was not an accident. It was the predictable result of prioritizing profit over safety. When cruelty becomes procedure, it stops feeling like cruelty. It becomes paperwork, reports, oversight meetings that do not change anything, and the harm continues because the system requires it. 4. Then it made catastrophe feel inevitable. The blackout showed how quickly a city can tip from order into widespread harm. One night, one power failure, and suddenly 1,600 buildings were looted or destroyed. 4,500 people were arrested. A city that looked stable revealed how much tension lay underneath. The lesson is grim. Stability is thinner than we want to believe, and when it breaks fast. I have thought about that blackout often. How quickly things can collapse, how much we depend on infrastructure we do not see, and how easily chaos can take over when the lights go out. 3. And then it turned execution into infrastructure. The history of the electric chair in New York is not just a tale of one prison, it is a reminder that the state can industrialize death. 614 executions took place at Sing Sing. The first electric chair was installed at Auburn. The spectacle of execution became routine, scheduled, bureaucratic. There were forms to fill out, witnesses to invite, protocols to follow. The state built rooms specifically for killing. It installed equipment, it trained operators, and it called it justice. That is what makes it so haunting. Not just that people were executed, but that execution became ordinary. Another function of government. 2. The darkest irony. The places we love most are often the ones with the deepest scars. Parks, icons, institutions. New York's beauty is real, but it sits on decisions that ruined lives. Central Park is stunning. It required displacement. Washington Square is beloved. It is built on graves. The skyline is magnificent. It was built with slave labor and slave-linked wealth. That tension is something we have to hold. You can love a place and also acknowledge its violence. You can visit a park and remember who was removed to create it. This is not about guilt, it is about honesty. 1. Closing unease. The city built on bones. There is no easy way to say this. New York is not just ambition and art and lights. It is also mass burial, displacement, poisoned neighborhoods, and systems that kept running after the truth was already known. 1 million people on Hart Island. 20,000 beneath Washington Square. Seneca Village erased. Love Canal poisoned. Rikers still operating. The deaths do not stop. The violence does not stop. And the city keeps moving, keeps building, keeps burying. Some places remember, New York is one of them. The question is whether we are willing to look.